Here's my countertop, getting ready to sand it because it's got a coat of polyurethane on there, and it's the oil-based polyurethane, not water-based. So I'm gonna sand that off. So let me show you a little bit closer. This is the way it looks now, and it's obviously it's still dirty even. I still got turmeric powder on there and there's spots on it, but this is the way I did it before. This is cement. I did this island, I don't know how many years ago, and I did the cement, the feather finish, the Ardex feather finish thing, except I used Home Depot's brand of feather finish. And I tinted it with concrete tint, black concrete tint, and then after the cement was on here, then I painted in these veins to make it look like soapstone. But I did some mistakes right here. There's like this square patch thing. I tried a concrete sealer in that spot right there. That didn't work, but that was the test spot, and so when I put the polyurethane on top of the whole countertop, this discolored. So that's always had that spot there, which is annoying, but we lived with it for a couple years like that. And then the veins I think are okay, but felt like they were way too apparent. I wish they were just a little bit more subtle. But when I was painting on the cement, they were very subtle, but when I put the polyurethane on it, it made them really pop out. So this countertop has seen better days. I've got my countertop back inside. I primed it, or I sanded it and primed it. Now I'm going to give it a light sand with 400 grit sandpaper just to take off any grittiness or burrs, or you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to paint over the shellac now with just a solid base coat of a black paint that I have. I'll have to link in the description to the color of it. It's not a pure black, it's kind of a charcoal gray color. And then after that dries, I will come over with a black and a white together and do kind of a mottled effect on the top as a second coat. Just kind of give it some movement and a little bit of variation in color, and so it's not a solid black. It'll be a variation, like soapstone is that charcoal gray, and it has a lot of movement in it, but I want it to be a subtle, real subtle movement of that. And then after that dries, we'll pour the epoxy clear. Then I'll use my spray paint to add in some veins. I'm gonna show you the primer up close and a little bit dark so that you can actually see it, because I wanted you to see that the primer does not get a solid coat. It is uneven, and that's okay. It's still gonna do the job. Just a real light sanding. You'll feel it. It's smooth. So just be careful on the corners that you don't sand too much and go through the primer. Sanding sponge, and this is 320, extra fine. Okay, so I'm putting on the first coat of black paint, and as it turns out, I had far less black paint left than I thought. So that's why I'm putting it on with a paintbrush rather than one of the small rollers, because I didn't want to have all the paint get sucked up in the roller cover. So I'm just putting it on with a brush. But by all means, you could use a roller, a small roller, in order to put your paint on the first coat, and it'll save you quite a bit of time. But I had to do it this way because I didn't have much paint left. Now I'm giving that first coat of paint a light sanding, just because that paint was a little bit old and so it was a little chunky, and I just wanted to sand off some of those bits and pieces that were stuck in the paint. It's not necessary to sand in between coats. The epoxy will completely smooth out anything, but it's not a bad idea, but not completely necessary. So now I'm just mixing up the paint for the second coat. I ran out of the black paint that I used for the first coat, so I'm just using artist acrylic, the folk art artist acrylic that you can buy at Michael's or Joann's, and I'm mixing a little bit of white house paint in there to get the correct tone of gray that I want. So you can use any kind of acrylic paint for this project. You just have to make sure it's latex or acrylic and not anything oil-based underneath your epoxy. And then I'm pouring a little bit of the pure black onto one disposable plate, and then I'll put some white on the other disposable plate, and this will be the paint that I'm going to kind of add in with my brush to the base coat that's in the bucket that I just mixed, that gray base coat. I'll take my brush and dip it into a little bit of black and dip it into a little bit of white to make my look. So this paint that I've mixed in my bucket, which was just the pure black pigment and a little bit of white to get the gray tone that I wanted, I'm going to put that down first so I've got a wet surface to work in. This is the edge that I'll add a little bit more paint in here. And like I said, don't worry about your brush strokes because the epoxy is going to level all that out. Okay, now we've got a nice wet base coat, and I'll take my 2 plates back here. This. Showing, okay. Okay, so you see how subtle that's looking? I'll put some more white on there and show you how. You just blend it in. I'll go with a little black here. That. And all this texture that your brush is making, it will all be leveled out by the epoxy. See how soft that is? And then this way, when I go to put my epoxy, I'll just pour my epoxy clear, then I'll put some veins in that to go along with some of these areas of color that I'm putting in. So see how nice and soft that is? All right, now let's go to the other side. Let's see if I can get the camera to pick up. So now I've got some kind of a streak of lighter there, and then kind of up here. And it's a little darker here, so now I can run a vein kind of along that streak. Okay, so now once this dries, I'm gonna give it 24 hours to dry completely, and then we'll pour the epoxy. So my base coat has dried overnight. Painted it yesterday morning, and now it's the next morning, so it's completely dry, probably 24 hours or more. I've got everything set up. I have all my area taped off, so I've taped off underneath my countertop and onto the floor. I'll show you that in just a second. And I've got all my supplies all here. So I've got my Total Boat 1-to-1 epoxy. This is the resin, and this is the cure or the hardener. Like I said, it's a 1-to-1 mixture. So I've got my 2 buckets, which I'll put 1 in each. These buckets have measuring on here, so it makes it very easy. And then I'll take both of these and dump them into a larger bucket. It's important that your bucket is completely flat inside, that there's no ridges or anything like that, because you need to be able to scrape the sides of your bucket. So you have to have completely flat sides, so don't skimp on buckets. Go ahead and buy your buckets flat. Don't use something that you have like a coffee can or something. Buy those. I've got my spreader and a brush in case I want to spread the paint a little bit. In case I don't like the way the veins are looking, I can just spread that out. I've got my spray paints, and I've already got a pool of spray paint sprayed in each of these buckets, so that once I get my epoxy poured onto the counter, I've already got that ready to go. I think that's it. I think I'm ready to go ahead and start mixing this up. Let me show you the plastic on the floor. Here's the way I've got it taped off, and then I've got plastic on the floor all the way around. The tape is right up underneath my countertop, particularly on the side here where there's less overhang. You just want to make sure you get it right right nice and tight there, and then your plastic should go onto the ground. And then what I like to do is just put a towel on the ground somewhere so that whenever I step off of the plastic, I always step onto the towel first to make sure there's nothing on my shoes. All taped off. So let's get mixing. So I've already got these opened up, and I'm gonna mix 18 ounces of each. There we go. This is the resin. Which the resin always pours slow. It's goopy. So okay, that's right at the 18-ounce mark. And the hardener is much thinner. No, actually, it's not. So one thing that you want to that's important is that your resin and your cure or hardener are at least 70 degrees, between 70 and 80 degrees. Otherwise, they don't mix well. And it's also super important that the mix is exactly 1-to-1. Okay, looks good. When they're separate in the separate buckets, nothing to worry about. Once you put them into the bucket together, you've got to mix them for 3 to 5 minutes and then pour it all out. Make sure that you pour it all out of your bucket, because anything that's left in your bucket will harden up in there pretty quickly. Okay, here we go. And make sure you scrape every bit out of these buckets. That's why it's important that you have a flat bucket, you know, the insides with no ridges or anything like that, because you have to get every bit out. Okay. Do you think you could set your timer for 5 minutes for me?
Sure. Starting right now?
Yep, thank you. All right, here we go for 5 minutes. Also, if you have a mixing paddle for your drill, that's a very good idea, although this is just fine with a small amount like this. Obviously, if you're doing larger amounts, you want to have a paddle for your drill. As you're mixing, you want to scrape the sides and the bottom and get every bit mixed up. I have another video where I did epoxy over laminate that I give a whole bunch of tips on the tools and your setup and kind of prepping for the epoxy at the beginning of that video, the laminate video. So I'll link to that here and you can check that one out, because there's a lot of tips for things that you should do to prep for the epoxy pour. The resin in the cure sometimes kind of acts like oil and vinegar, where it wants to just like push away from each other, so. Five minutes? Okay, thank you. Okay. Good idea to cover up all your surrounding surfaces, because you'll want to set things there, so. All right, let me adjust so you can see the whole counter. And scraping every bit out of the bucket because it looks like I'm going to need it, and because anything left in here will just harden up. If it's spread out on your countertop, you have a much longer working time. Whereas if it sits in a pool in your bucket, it's going to harden up in 5 minutes. So I'm just kind of mixing it up even further on my countertop, just in case. Because like I said, it seems to like to separate like oil and water. So just giving it another little bit of a mix on here, because the last thing you want are soft spots in your resin. Okay, now I'm going to start just spreading it out to cover my surface. And this first coat, you could do this with a foam roller or like a squeegee. I'm just spreading it out almost to the edges, but not over the edges yet. Bringing it right to the edge to make sure I've got enough to cover everything. That is perfect, it looks like. I mixed up 18 ounces of each, and this is 8 feet by 4 feet, I think, or yeah. And so that's just perfect amount, it looks like. Okay, now I'll get this all the way to the edge, and then I'll let this flow over. Okay, so I'm gonna start letting it flow over the edge, since I've got it everywhere on my countertop. Hear it starting to flow. And it's actually better if you keep it on your countertop and don't let it flow over the edge until it's set up for just a couple minutes, because then it's not going to just run off the top of your counter like water. It'll just slowly make its way down the edges of your countertop, which is really what you want, because you don't want to lose all that epoxy off the edges of your counter. See how the front is going real slow over the edge? That's really what you want. And then I'll take my foam brushes and brush the edges. So you've got about a 45-minute working time on this, so you don't have to stress. All right, so I've got full coverage everywhere. Now I'll grab my foam brush, and I'm just going to get some epoxy on here. So get your brush wet, and then just brush the edges. Make sure you've got... You can dip into the puddles where you can tell that your epoxy is thicker and grab some of that for your edges. And if it starts to feel like it's getting thick on you, just hit it with your heat gun and it'll make it workable again. Okay, now this will level out a little bit and pop some bubbles. Sometimes there's voids. You might see areas where there's like a separation where it's not covering. Just hit it with your glove finger. And if it's still dripping, swipe it. I'm really liking the paint effect underneath here. It did darken up to where I want it, so that's good. I see a bunch of spots over here where it's kind of separated. Big void right there. Wiping off the drips. Okay, I think what I need to do is get some epoxy on it. So, if you mix your paint in with some of this leftover epoxy that's in the bucket, which is already starting to set up a little bit, then your paint won't spread out on top of your counter. You'll get a real fine vein line rather than a wide spread out thing. Let's go ahead and get a little bit of this lighter color on here. So here's what I've got. That's the lighter color, so it's not white. There's the epoxy bucket. So I'm going to put a little bit of this beige in with the dark gray. And do one right here. Okay. I just don't want it tends to pull out into like a circle, so I don't like that, so I just like to separate it up a little bit with my finger and then so this is a super duper thin line of the beige that I'm just following back over that same line that I did with the dark gray. Get a little bit more of that beige. So I'm just mixing a little bit of the gray paint into the bucket that had the little bit of epoxy left in it, along with some of the dark gray paint in there. So when you mix the paint in with that little bit of epoxy, it makes the consistency of the paint a little bit thicker, and therefore it doesn't just spread out on your countertop when you put it down. It stays in a thin vein line better than if you just put straight paint on there. Just the straight paint will just spread out on the countertop. So that's why you want to mix a little bit of epoxy with it so it'll stay in that vein shape. Okay, I'm going to hit that with the heat gun and move some things around a little bit. Seems like inevitably you'll get voids in the epoxy in random places. So hit them with your finger, and now that you're going to do a second coat. Okay, so here it is inside my kitchen with the window behind me. And there's that vein right there. You want to definitely have it go over the edge. And then I had it kind of split right there and go up there all the way across. And then here's the other vein right there. So you can see on this area here how the undercoat of paint that I did is right here. I love it. I think it looks very soapstone-ish. I guess soapstone has a lot more tiny veins oftentimes, but second coat will cover any imperfections and waviness. You can kind of see the where the veins are. It's a little uneven, so the second coat will cover all that and make it completely smooth. Okay, so a couple things that you want to do to make this the best possible outcome is turn off your AC or your heat, because if you have a vent that's blowing anywhere nearby and you have a little bit of dust in the vent or in the air, it could end up on your top, and that's happened to me before. I laid down all the first coat of epoxy and then left, and the AC was on, and when I came back I walked in the door and you could see peppered over the top of the counter there was dust, and that's a big bummer. So now this first coat is drying, and I'm just going to try to step away and not stand here and look at it all day. So see you on the second coat. So the second coat goes on just like the first coat. You just mix it up 1 to 1 just like the first coat and mix it for 3 to 5 minutes and then pour it out the same way. This time I used a brush to spread it because my spreader was stuck in the bottom of the bucket. So I just used a small brush and I used my heat gun to help me spread it out a little bit, to thin it out and spread it because it started to thicken up on me and it didn't want to spread well with the brush. So I was just heating it up as I spread it with my brush. And then after you get it covering the whole top, I really hit it really well with the heat gun so that it would level out really level, like glass. So I didn't have any kind of voids or anything. The second coat, you don't really get any voids. It adheres to that first coat really well. But I hit it real good with the heat gun for a good few minutes to make sure I had any bubbles out of there. And then of course hit the edges with my brush. I used my phone flashlight in order to make sure I didn't have any drips. Here it is, poured and completely dry, and it is high gloss, so it's super, super high gloss. And I'll show you some close-ups of the veining. So there's the one on this side. And I ran it one into the stove and one all the way across. And you can kind of see on the sides where it's got the variation in color that I did with the paint before I even poured the epoxy. And you can also kind of see that here. There's a little bit of that texture. And then the other side, this other vein, and you can see the little bit of texture on the front there as well as there, and you can kind of see the texture in the paint here, which I think looks very much like soapstone, that look. And then here's the other vein that I did, and you can see the paint texture there, very subtle but soapstone looking. And this is the vein on the other side that I made split. So I'm really happy with the way that this came out. Thanks again to Total Boat for gifting me the epoxy for this project. If you are thinking of doing epoxy either in a rental or potentially as a temporary solution, it is well worth it. You can do it on a real tight budget, not all that much work. So you can have a beautiful home on a very tight budget if you're willing to put in a little elbow grease. So see you next time, y'all. Thanks for watching.